Smoke still hung in the tunnel mouth when Shou Yinglin threw open the carved lid of her wedding trunk and began to tear the red silk gown into strips. Men lay bleeding on the frozen ground, the camp's bandages gone in the first 10 minutes, the nearest doctor 2 days behind a wall of snow. She did not hesitate over the embroidery her mother had stitched for a wedding that would never happen now. A foreman's voice broke through the smoke, hoarse, disbelieving. "That's your dowry, girl." She did not look up. "It was," she said. "Now it's bandages." 3 weeks earlier she had stepped off a wagon at a railroad camp cut into Sierra granite, a trunk of bridal silk lashed to her back and a marriage contract folded inside her sleeve. The man she had crossed an ocean to marry, Chen Bo, had died in a tunnel blast a month before her ship ever reached San Francisco. The paymaster studied his ledger, not her face. "Debt don't die with the groom," he said. Around her, men spoke of her price as though she were a crate of powder awaiting delivery, and understood nothing of what she carried besides silk. Only the tunnel foreman, a granite quiet man named Jonas Calder, ever asked her name before he asked what she was worth. He said it plainly, without kindness dressed up as pity, and something in her straightened at the sound of it. She answered him in careful English, and he did not correct her, did not laugh. Outside, snow gathered over the pass in slow gray walls, and somewhere above the tunnel face, black powder waited packed into granite that had already taken one man from her without ever letting her meet him. What happened at that tunnel mouth would decide more than which men lived through the night. It would decide whether a woman bought and sold on paper could ever be seen as something other than cargo, and whether a man who judged people by their work alone could admit what her silk had truly cost her. It began, as these things do, with a ship, a promise already broken, and a trunk she had not yet learned to call anything but hope. The steamship crossed 40 days of gray Pacific water before Shou Yinglin ever saw the coast that was supposed to become her home. She kept the wedding trunk beside her narrow berth the entire voyage, one hand resting on its carved lid through every storm, as though the ship itself might try to take it from her. Inside lay everything her mother had sewn across 2 winters, a red silk gown embroidered with phoenixes at the collar, an underrobe the color of new peaches, a veil folded in tissue, and tucked beneath the fabric, wrapped in oilcloth, the satchel of dried roots and dried yarrow her mother pressed into her hands at the dock in Guangzhou. A marriage contract, signed by a matchmaker on behalf of a railroad laborer named Chen Bo, rode folded inside her sleeve the whole crossing, read so many times the ink had begun to soften at the creases. She had never seen his face, only a description passed through 2 brokers and a letter written in another man's hand. She told herself that a face would come later, that patience was simply another kind of dowry. When land finally broke the horizon, gray and enormous, she stood at the rail and practiced the English words she had learned from a missionary's wife. 3 sentences, careful as stitches, meant to carry her into a new life. San Francisco received her the way a warehouse receives freight, with tags and ledgers and men who spoke over her head instead of to her. A broker named Halloran met her at the dock with a manifest and did not ask her name before writing one down. He walked her past crates of powder and coils of rail line to a train bound east into mountains she had only heard described as walls of stone tall enough to hold snow through July. She rode 3 days in a car meant for freight, the trunk wedged between her knees, watching California fold itself upward into granite and pine. Other Chinese laborers on the same train spoke of a camp cut into the Sierra, where the railroad was blasting a passage clean through the mountain, tunnel by tunnel, winter storm by winter storm. They spoke of Chen Bo's name too, quietly, in a tone she did not yet understand. When she finally asked why the men grew silent whenever she said her intended's name, an old man beside her only shook his head and told her to wait until she reached camp, that some news traveled better on solid ground than on a moving train, where a woman had nowhere to put her grief. The camp announced itself first as sound, the ring of sledges on drill steel and the low percussion of black powder somewhere inside the mountain, then as smell, wood smoke, and wet granite dust, before Shoying ever saw the tents strung along the grade like a second, temporary town. Halloran walked her straight to a paymaster's shack without letting her set the trunk down. Inside, a heavy-set company clerk studied a ledger far longer than he studied her face. Chen Bo, he said at last, had been killed 6 weeks earlier when a fuse burned faster than a crew expected, and the company considered the matter closed. Shoying asked, in her careful 3 sentences, what that meant for her. The clerk only tapped the ledger. Her passage, Her contract fee, the matchmaker's commission, none of it had died with a man who could no longer pay it, he said, and someone would need to settle the account one way or another. She stood very straight through the whole exchange, the trunk gripped against her side, and translated nothing on her face for either man to read. They put her to work in the camp kitchen the same afternoon, ladling rice and boiled pork into tin plates for 200 men who barely glanced up from their bowls. An older cook named Kwok showed her where the water barrel stood and where the good knives were kept, and said nothing about Chen Bo, which she understood as its own kind of mercy. That night she unpacked only what she needed and left the wedding silk folded exactly as her mother had folded it, unwilling yet to admit that no wedding was coming. Word of her unpaid contract moved through camp faster than she could follow it in English. By the second day, a dry goods merchant named Whitfield had already asked Halloran what the girl's debt would cost to transfer, and whether she came with any particular skills worth the price. Halloran said he'd find out. From the cook fire, Shu Ying watched the two men study her the way they might study a mule at auction, weighing weight against usefulness, and understood, before anyone bothered translating it for her, exactly what kind of camp she had crossed an ocean to reach. The days folded into a hard rhythm of steam and ash. Shu Ying rose before dawn to start the rice, boiled water for the crews heading up to the tunnel face, and mended shirts by firelight after the last plate was scraped clean. She learned the camp's shape by its sounds, the foreman's whistle at shift change, the particular silence that fell over the mess tent whenever the tunnel foreman, a broad-shouldered American named Jonas Calder, walked through checking on his men. The other cooks spoke of him the way they spoke of weather that could be trusted, hard but not cruel, a man who counted his crew twice after every blast and did not leave until the count matched. He never lingered near the kitchen fire the way some of the company men did, never spoke about her within her hearing the way Whitfield had taken to doing. She noticed him mostly by his absence from every cruelty she had come to expect, and told herself that noticing a man's decency was not the same as trusting it, not yet, not in a camp where kindness so often came with a price attached. Whitfield made his offer inside the paymaster's shack on a Thursday, loud enough that Shu Ying, waiting outside with a delivery of mended linens, heard every word through the canvas wall. He wanted the girl's contract transferred to his store, he said, where a woman who could read a ledger and count coin correctly would be worth considerably more than her outstanding debt. He assumed, as many of them did, that her silence in English meant an absence of understanding, and spoke of her the way he might describe a piece of equipment recently repaired. Halloran hedged, said the company preferred to settle debts in cash rather than trade in people directly, though the distinction seemed thin to Shu Ying as she stood gripping a basket of clean shirts. When she finally stepped inside to deliver them, both men fell silent, and Whitfield looked her over with open calculation before asking, in the slow, loud voice people used for the deaf, whether she understood English at all. "I understand plenty," she said, each word placed like a stone, and watched something flicker behind his eyes that might have been surprise, or might have been the first shape of dislike. It was a boy named Tam, orphaned onto the camp 2 winters earlier and fluent in the particular pidgin of a place built by a dozen languages at once, who first made Shu Ying laugh since crossing the ocean. He ran messages between crews for pennies and scraps, and took to trailing her at the cook fire, translating gossip she hadn't asked for and teaching her English words no missionary's wife would have chosen, words for mud and stubborn mules, and the particular curse a man used when he dropped a hot kettle. In exchange, she taught him to fold dumplings properly, and to recognize the dried roots in her mother's satchel by smell alone, ginseng from dongui, yarrow from wild garlic. He was the one who told her, matter-of-fact as weather, that Calder had asked Halloran directly whether the company intended to sell her like freight, and that Halloran had laughed and said something about supply and demand. Tam relayed it without understanding why Shu Ying's hands went still over the dough, why she asked him twice to repeat exactly what Calder had said next, and whether he had sounded angry or merely curious. Halloran set the terms without consulting her, as she had come to expect. Whitfield's offer would stand for 1 month, after which, absent a better price, the transfer would proceed regardless of her preference in the matter, since her preference, as he put it, had never been part of the original contract. Shu Ying counted the weeks on her fingers at night, the way her mother had taught her to count debts owed and debts paid. Meanwhile, the tunnel crept deeper into the mountain's granite spine, the rock harder than anything the crews had blasted through before, requiring more powder packed tighter into the face with every charge. Calder began doubling the count after each blast, walking the tunnel mouth himself before letting any man back inside. Snow had started falling above the grade in earnest now, burying the wagon road a little further every week, and the camp's store of medical supplies, always thin, grew thinner, with no resupply wagon able to climb the pass. Nobody spoke yet of what might happen if the mountain and the calendar both ran out of patience at the same time, but Shu Ying had begun watching the tunnel mouth the way she watched Whitfield, waiting to see which threat would arrive first. The incident that first drew Jonas Calder's direct attention happened over a sack of rice, not a tunnel blast. The camp store's scale had been reading light for weeks, a discrepancy the storekeeper blamed on damp weather swelling the wood, until Shu Ying, delivering the kitchen's weekly order, noticed the counterweight itself had been filed down at one edge, shaving a few ounces off every transaction in the company's favor and against every laborer's wages. She said nothing to the storekeeper, who would not have listened, but mentioned it quietly to Kwok, who mentioned it to a crew boss, who eventually mentioned it, exasperated, to Calder himself, while the tunnel foreman happened to be standing at the store counter. Calder tested the weight against a known measure without a word to anyone, found her correct within a hair, and had the scale replaced by the following morning. He said nothing to Shu Ying directly that day. But the next time their paths crossed near the cook fire, he stopped, studied her for a long moment the way he might study a fault line in granite, and asked, in a voice with no pity folded into it, what her name actually was, since the paymaster's ledger clearly hadn't bothered to ask. Shu Ying Lin, she said, and watched him repeat it back carefully, getting the vowels imperfect but trying, which was more than the paymaster or Whitfield had ever attempted. He told her his own name in return, Jonas Calder, foreman of the tunnel crew, as though the introduction were an ordinary courtesy between equals, rather than an accident of one man's decency. She answered him in the careful 3 sentences she had practiced on the ship, added a 4th she had learned since, and he did not correct her grammar or laugh at the accent, only nodded as though her English were simply English, adequate to the purpose of being understood. It was, she realized later, the first entire conversation she'd had at that camp in which nobody had discussed her price. Tam, watching from a safe distance with a bowl of rice halfway to his mouth, reported the exchange to Kwok in tones of considerable astonishment, and Kwok only said that Calder had always been strange that way, treating people according to what they did rather than what they cost, a habit the old cook considered either very foolish or very rare. Calder began finding reasons to pass the cook fire more often after that, never staying long, never saying much beyond a nod or a brief word about the weather closing in over the pass. Once he brought a crate of medical bandages recovered from a supply wagon that had turned back before reaching the merchant's store, and left it with Kwok without explanation, though everyone understood well enough who had likely diverted it from Whitfield's inventory instead. Shu Ying learned from Tam, who learned everything eventually, that Calder had once had a sister back east who died of a fever nobody in her town had known how to treat properly, and that he had never since been able to walk past an untreated wound without doing something about it, whether or not it was his responsibility. It explained, she thought, why a man built entirely of granite quiet reserve would break his silence over a filed-down scale weight, why fairness seemed to sit in him like a bone rather than a policy. She did not let herself think further than that, not with Whitfield's deadline still marked on her fingers, not with a wedding trunk still folded shut in her tent like a door she had not yet decided to close. The storm that had been threatening the pass for weeks finally arrived in earnest during the 3rd week of Shu Ying's stay, burying the wagon road under drifts deep enough to swallow a mule to its shoulders. Word came down from the railroad's eastern office that the Central Pacific needed to match its rival's pace mile for mile before spring, regardless of snow, regardless of granite that fought back harder than any rock the crews had blasted through before. Calder argued for slower charges, smaller loads of powder packed with more care into the granite face, and was overruled by a company man who cared more about the calendar than the mountain. The crews went back to double charges the following morning, packing more black powder tighter into drill holes than Calder liked, working a rock face already laced with hairline fractures nobody could see from outside. Shu Ying watched the men file up toward the tunnel mouth in the gray pre-dawn light, watched Calder walk the line last as always, counting heads, and felt without knowing why a cold unease settle into her chest that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with a mountain that had already taken one man from her without asking permission. A young driller named Sam scalded his forearm badly on an overturned kettle of tar used for waterproofing timber, and the camp's meager doctor's kit, kept by a company clerk more interested in inventory than practice, offered nothing but a bottle of carbolic acid and a suggestion to keep it clean. Shou-Ying, changing the boy's dressing later that evening at Kwok's quiet suggestion, opened her mother's satchel for the first time since crossing the ocean, and made a poultice from dried yarrow and a root she'd carried folded in oilcloth since Guangzhou, binding it with a strip of plain cotton rather than touch the silk still sealed in her trunk. The burn healed clean and fast enough that even the company clerk noticed, though he credited it to luck rather than to the quiet Chinese cook who'd actually done the work. Calder heard about it from Tam, as he heard about most things eventually, and said nothing to Shou-Ying directly. But the crate of bandages he left at the kitchen tent that week came, for the first time, with a small paper packet of dried ginger tucked inside it, as though he had gone looking specifically for something her satchel might need refilled. Halloran cornered her outside the mess tent to remind her, unprompted, that Whitfield's month was nearly spent, and that the transfer would proceed the following week, absent some unlikely intervention from a company with no particular interest in her preferences. Shou-Ying said, in English steadier than it had been a month earlier, that she understood the arrangement perfectly, and that understanding it did not mean accepting it. Halloran only shrugged and walked off, unbothered by a distinction that had never mattered to men who wrote ledgers for a living. That evening Calder found her mending a torn sleeve by the fire and asked, without preamble, whether the rumor about Whitfield's deadline was true. When she confirmed it, he was quiet long enough that she assumed the conversation had ended, until he said, low and plain, that a debt owed to a dead man's contract wasn't the same as a debt owed to a living employer, and that he intended to look into exactly what the company could and couldn't legally transfer without her consent. It wasn't a promise, she understood that, but it was the first time anyone at that camp had used the word consent in connection with her at all. The blizzard that sealed the pass for good arrived without much warning, a wall of white that erased the wagon road entirely within a single night and kept erasing it for 3 days afterward. The supply wagon that had been due that week, carrying among other things a fresh crate of bandages, quinine, and the carbolic acid the camp's kit had nearly exhausted, turned back at a way station 12 miles down the grade rather than risk the drifts, and word reached camp by a half-frozen rider that no further shipment could be expected until the pass cleared, which might be weeks. Calder took the news grimly, walked the tunnel mouth twice that afternoon studying the rock face with an intensity Shou-Ying had learned to read as worry rather than routine. The company's man from the eastern office, unmoved by weather he did not have to work in, sent word that the blasting schedule would continue regardless, that a mountain, unlike a calendar, did not care about snow. Shou-Ying returned to her tent that night and looked, for a long moment, at the wedding trunk still sealed shut in the corner, its silk folded exactly as her mother had left it, and could not have said, even to herself, why she suddenly could not stop thinking about it. Calder spent 2 evenings that week going through the company's paperwork with a lawyer's patience he'd apparently learned the hard way somewhere before the railroad, and came to Shou-Ying at the cook fire with news delivered as plainly as everything else he said. Her original contract had been signed on Chen Bo's behalf, and under the company's own rules, a debt tied to a specific marriage arrangement technically dissolved when the marriage itself became impossible, regardless of what Halloran preferred to believe. It wasn't a solution yet, he admitted, since Halloran would fight the interpretation, and Whitfield had money enough to make fighting worthwhile. But it was something to stand on, and Shou-Ying found she had not realized how much weight she'd been carrying until a small part of it lifted. Above them, the tunnel crew prepared the next charge for the deepest section of granite they'd yet attempted, packed heavier than Calder liked under orders he couldn't refuse. In rock the recent cold had fractured in ways no one on the surface could see. Snow kept falling. The pass stayed sealed, and somewhere inside the mountain, a fuse waited to be lit on a morning that would change every calculation anyone at that camp had made about debts, and about worth, and about what a person was willing to give away for someone else's survival. Calder brought his argument to Halloran directly on a morning cold enough to crack the ink in the paymaster's inkwell, laying out in blunt terms why the transfer to Whitfield had no legal ground to stand on now that the original marriage contract had died, along with the man it was written for. Halloran, unwilling to lose a transaction he'd already half promised, sent for Whitfield, and the argument that followed filled the paymaster's shack with enough raised voices that half the camp found reasons to walk past the canvas wall. Whitfield accused Calder of overstepping a foreman's proper business, of caring more about a Chinese cook's paperwork than about the tunnel he was paid to finish. Calder answered, according to Tam, who had pressed his ear to the canvas without shame, that he cared about a debt being enforced against someone who'd never agreed to owe it, and that if Whitfield wanted to argue the point in front of the company's regional office instead of a camp paymaster, he was welcome to try. Nothing was settled that morning, but Whitfield left the shack considerably quieter than he'd entered it, and word of the confrontation moved through camp faster than any blizzard, carrying Shu Ying's name alongside Calder's for the first time as something other than a transaction. Not everyone in camp welcomed the news the way Kwok and Tam did. A handful of company loyalists among the drilling crews grumbled that a foreman had no business meddling in a paymaster's ledgers over a cook, that favoritism toward one Chinese woman set an uncomfortable precedent nobody had asked for. Shu Ying heard the grumbling secondhand, as she heard most things, and found her feelings about the whole matter more complicated than simple gratitude. She had spent her entire crossing learning to survive by her own competence, her own careful English, her own quiet usefulness, and some stubborn part of her resisted the idea of being rescued by a man's intervention, rather than earning her freedom through proof of her own worth. She said as much to Calder the next time their paths crossed, plainly, the way he spoke to her. He considered it a long moment, then said he understood the objection, but that a debt built on a fiction didn't require her to prove anything to anyone, and that the only thing he'd actually done was point out a fact the company's own rules already contained. It wasn't rescue, he said. It was arithmetic. She found, against her better judgment, that she believed him. The tunnel crew hit the hardest section of granite yet that same week, a vein of rock so dense the drill steel dulled twice as fast as anywhere else along the grade, and Calder's objections to the company's blasting schedule grew sharper with every foot they advanced. A charge 2 days earlier had gone off slightly early, the fuse burning faster than the crew's timing allowed for, and though no one had been badly hurt, the near miss left every man on the crew a half-step more careful, and Calder considerably less patient with the Eastern office's insistence on speed. He requested smaller, more frequent charges instead of the heavy loads currently favored, argued that the fractured rock they were working through absorbed force unpredictably, and was told again, in a telegram relayed up from the valley, that Union Pacific crews 300 miles east were laying track twice as fast, and that the Central Pacific's investors expected comparable progress regardless of local conditions. Calder read the telegram twice, said nothing for a long moment, then walked up to the tunnel mouth alone and stood there in the cold a while, before returning to organize the next day's charge exactly as ordered, because a foreman without authority over his own schedule had, in the end, no other choice. That evening, with the storm briefly quieted and stars visible for the first time in a week over the black shoulder of the mountain, Calder found Shu Ying outside the kitchen tent, checking the last of the fires before sleep. He didn't say much at first, just stood near the dying coals with his hands in his coat pockets, watching the same stars she was watching. He told her eventually about his sister, the fever nobody back east had known how to treat, how he'd been 3 states away working a different rail line when the letter finally reached him, too late to matter. It was the first time he'd offered her anything about himself unprompted, and she understood it for the gift it was, a debt of honesty repaid for the honesty she'd shown him about her own circumstances. She told him in return about her mother's satchel, about roots and herbs whose names had no English equivalent, about a grandmother in Guangdong who'd taught 3 generations of women in her family how to read a wound and know what it needed. Neither of them mentioned Whitfield, or the tunnel, or tomorrow's charge. For one quiet evening, under stars neither of them had expected to share, it was simply 2 people talking. Morning came gray and hard, the temporary truce with the weather already breaking apart into fresh snow by the time the crew assembled at the tunnel mouth. Calder walked the line as he always did, counting heads, checking each man's gear with the same care he gave every charge, though something in his manner that morning struck Shu Ying as more deliberate than usual, as though he were memorizing the count rather than simply taking it. He caught her eye briefly across the yard before turning to lead the crew inside, and there was nothing dramatic in the look. No foreboding either of them could have named, only the ordinary nod of 2 people who had begun, cautiously, to matter to each other. She went back to the kitchen fire and began the day's rice as she did every morning, listening for the distant, familiar rhythm of drill steel against granite that meant the crew had reached the face and begun their work. The sound continued, steady and unremarkable, for nearly 3 hours. Then, without warning, without the pattern any charge should have followed, the mountain made a sound Xiao Ying had never heard before, low and enormous, and the ground beneath the cook fire trembled once, hard, before the whole camp went suddenly, terribly silent. The tunnel mouth exhaled a column of dust and smoke that seemed to hang in the cold air far longer than it should have, and for a long, terrible minute nobody moved, as though the whole camp were waiting to see whether the mountain intended to take anything further. Then men began running, Kwok among them, shouting for anyone with strength left to help carry the wounded out into the gray daylight. Xiao Ying reached the tunnel mouth to find 8 men laid out on the frozen ground, 2 with legs crushed under fallen timber, 3 bleeding from gashes torn open by flying rock, 1 with burns along his arm and shoulder from a secondary charge that had caught before he cleared the blast radius. The company clerk who kept the medical kit stood over the scene, wringing his hands uselessly, informing anyone who'd listened that the bandages had run out entirely 2 weeks earlier and never been restocked, that the carbolic acid was down to a half bottle, that he had, in short, nothing left to offer men bleeding out onto frozen granite in a camp the blizzard had sealed off from the rest of the world for what might be another 2 weeks. Calder emerged from the tunnel last, favoring one leg and bleeding from a cut above his eyebrow he seemed not to notice, and immediately began directing the wounded into some order of urgency. The 2 crushed legs first, the burns second, the gashes after. He called for the medical kit and received, in response, only the clerk's useless account of what the camp no longer had. A company inspector visiting from the valley office, a thin man named Pruitt who had arrived the day before to review the blasting schedule, suggested from a safe distance that the crew should perhaps focus on clearing the tunnel debris rather than delaying work over injuries that would likely heal or not heal, regardless of camp intervention. A suggestion Calder answered with a look that sent the man retreating several steps without further comment. Xiao Ying stood at the edge of the scene, taking in the wounded, the empty medical kit, the blizzard that had sealed the only road to more supplies, and felt something in her go very still and very clear, the way her mother's voice used to go still and clear in the moment before a decision that could not be taken back. She ran back to her tent faster than she had moved since stepping off the ship, dropped to her knees before the wedding trunk, and threw open the carved lid her mother had latched shut in Guangzhou with such careful hope. The red silk gown lay on top exactly where she'd folded it, phoenixes embroidered at the collar catching what little light came through the tent flap, and for one suspended second, Xiao Ying's hand hovered over the fabric without moving, the whole weight of everything it represented pressing down at once, a wedding that would never happen, a mother's 2 winters of careful stitching, the last unbroken piece of the life she had crossed an ocean expecting to live. Then she heard, from the direction of the tunnel mouth, a man's voice crying out in pain loud enough to carry across the entire camp, and her hand stopped hovering. She lifted the gown, gathered the underrobe and the folded veil beneath it, grabbed her mother's satchel of dried roots from where it had been tucked against the trunk's lining since the crossing, and ran back toward the wounded with everything she owned that might possibly save someone, tearing the first strip of silk from the hem before she had even reached the tunnel mouth. She knelt first beside the man with the worst of the burns, cutting away the ruined fabric of his sleeve with a knife Kwok pressed into her hand, and wrapped the wound in silk that had been dyed the exact peach color her mother had chosen for the day Xiao Ying would have worn it beneath a scarlet outer gown. She moved to the next man, and the next, tearing strip after strip from a garment 2 winters in the making, packing the herbal poultice from her mother's satchel against gashes the camp's exhausted carbolic acid could no longer reach in sufficient quantity. Calder, directing the crushed leg cases onto makeshift splints a few feet away, glanced up mid-motion and saw, for the first time, exactly what fabric she was using, recognized the fineness of the weave even through blood and dust, understood with the particular clarity of a man who had once lost someone to an untreated wound precisely what kind of silk did not simply appear in a laborer's kit by accident. He did not say anything yet, there wasn't time, and the words that would eventually need saying were too large for the chaos of that frozen ground, but something in his face changed, sharpened, and Xiao Ying, tearing the last clean section of the veil into strips, understood that he had finally seen exactly what she was giving away, and that the night ahead would decide whether it had been enough. Night came down hard and early, the way it always did in the mountains in winter, and the makeshift infirmary they'd assembled inside the mess tent burned every lamp the camp could spare against the dark. Xiao Ying worked without stopping, moving between the 8 wounded men with a focus that let her set aside, for the hours it required, everything the silk in her hands had once meant to her. Tam kept the fire fed and boiled water for cleaning wounds between changes of dressing. Kwok held men still when the pain made them thrash, and murmured to them in the dialect of home, low reassurances that seemed to steady them more than anything the camp's actual doctor, still 2 days behind the blizzard, could have offered. Xiao Ying changed each dressing twice before midnight, checking the herbal poultices against fevers that had already begun rising in 2 of the men, and found herself grateful, in a distant, exhausted way, for a grandmother's lessons she had never expected to need this far from the mountains where she'd first learned them. Calder came through every hour to check the count, the way he checked it after every blast, and each time his eyes went first to her hands before they went to the wounded. The burned man's fever climbed past midnight until even Kwok's steady murmuring couldn't quiet him, and Xiao Ying, checking her supply of clean silk by lamplight, found only one piece left untouched, the embroidered veil. Phoenix and peony worked in gold thread across white silk her mother had chosen specifically for the moment a bride's face would be lifted for a groom's first look. She had saved it without quite admitting to herself that she was saving it, some superstitious corner of her heart insisting it should be the last thing sacrificed rather than the first. Calder, passing through on his hourly check, saw her hesitate over it and reached out, almost involuntarily, to stop her hand. "You don't have to," he said, low, meaning it plainly the way he meant everything. She looked at him a long moment, then at the burned man whose breathing had gone shallow and fast, and said that a veil meant for a wedding that would never happen wasn't worth more than a man who might still live to see morning. She cut it into strips herself, steady-handed, and packed the last of her mother's yarrow against the worst of the burn, and Calder, watching her do it, understood in that moment exactly what kind of woman he had been standing beside all these weeks without fully seeing her. Dawn arrived gray and merciless, the same color as every dawn that winter, but inside the mess tent the fevers had begun, cautiously, to break. The burned man slept instead of thrashing. The 2 crushed leg cases, splinted through the night by lamplight, had color back in their faces that hadn't been there at midnight. Xiao sat back on her heels for the first time in 12 hours, hands raw, the wedding trunk in her tent now holding nothing but her mother's empty satchel and the plain cotton lining it had traveled in from Guangzhou. Calder found her there in the gray early light, sat down beside her without asking permission, and said, quietly, that he had buried a sister once for lack of exactly the kind of care she had just given 8 strangers for nothing more than the asking. He said he understood now what the silk had actually cost her, not the ounces of fabric but the entire shape of the life it represented, a wedding, a mother's 2 winters of stitching, the last unbroken piece of home she'd carried across an ocean. Xiao Ying said only that a dowry meant for one kind of life could still be useful in another, but something had shifted between them in that tent overnight that neither of them yet had the words to name, and outside, the storm was finally, quietly, beginning to lift. The lifting storm brought its own complications, with the pass finally clearing enough for a rider to attempt the 12 miles to the way station. Pruitt, the company inspector, wasted no time drafting his report on the accident, and word reached the kitchen tent by mid-afternoon that his account laid unusual emphasis on crew error rather than on the company's own insistence on heavier charges against Calder's explicit objection. A blast that size, Pruitt's report apparently suggested, didn't happen without someone on the Chinese drilling crew misjudging a fuse length or packing a charge incorrectly, a conclusion considerably more convenient for the company's investors than an admission that the Eastern office's schedule had forced dangerous shortcuts onto rock everyone on site had known was unstable. Calder heard about the report before it left camp and went looking for Pruitt immediately, jaw set in a way Xiao Ying had not yet seen from him. Whatever exhaustion the night had left in his shoulders seemed to burn away entirely at the prospect of his crew, and specifically of Xiao Ying, being made to answer for a company decision none of them had been permitted to refuse, and camp held its breath waiting to see which version of the accident would ultimately reach the valley below. Calder found Pruitt at the paymaster's shack, preparing to send his report down the mountain by the first rider able to make the trip, and laid out, in front of Halloran and 2 of the crew bosses who'd gathered at the sound of raised voices, exactly why the inspector's account didn't match what every man on that crew had witnessed. He produced his own written objections to the heavier charges, filed weeks earlier and ignored by the Eastern Office, cited the near miss from days before the accident as evidence the crew had already been flagging unsafe conditions nobody above them wanted to hear about, and stated plainly that any report blaming Chinese laborers for a company's own scheduling decisions would need to go through him before it went through the mail. Pruitt protested that a foreman didn't have authority to edit an inspector's findings. Calder answered that a foreman did have authority over whether his crew's testimony appeared in that report at all, and that 8 wounded men and 1 exhausted cook currently recovering in the mess tent had rather a lot to say about who'd actually kept the accident from becoming a funeral. Word spread through camp by evening that Calder had demanded the wounded men's own accounts be included in whatever report finally left for the valley, and one by one, still bandaged in Shu Ying's silk, they gave them. The burned man, well enough now to sit up and speak, told anyone who'd listen that he owed his arm, possibly his life, to a Chinese cook who'd torn apart her own wedding dress without a second's hesitation, while a company clerk stood by wringing his hands over an empty medical kit. Even the crew members who'd grumbled weeks earlier about a foreman meddling on a cook's behalf found themselves, without quite deciding to, defending her at the mess tent fire, repeating the story of the silk to anyone new who hadn't yet heard it. Halloran, sensing which way camp sentiment had turned and unwilling to keep defending a transfer that increasingly looked like selling off the one person who'd just saved a third of his workforce, quietly informed Whitfield the following morning that the company would not be pursuing the contract sale after all, citing complications with the original agreement that he did not care to elaborate on. Calder made the final gesture in front of the whole camp, at the evening meal, in a manner deliberately public enough that no one could later claim confusion about where matters stood. He walked into the mess tent carrying the original contract Halloran had reluctantly produced, read the terms aloud once so no one could say afterward that its cancellation had happened quietly or by accident, and then tore the document in half in front of 200 men who had, 3 days earlier, watched a woman empty her wedding trunk to save 8 of their own. Xiao Ying, standing near the cook fire with a ladle still in her hand, watched the paper fall in pieces and felt something in her chest loosen that had been clenched tight since the paymaster's shack on her first afternoon in camp. Calder didn't make a speech about it. He said only that a debt built on a contract for a man who no longer existed had no business being enforced against a woman who'd just proven, with her own hands and her own dowry, exactly what she was worth to that camp, and that anyone who disagreed could take the matter up with him directly. The camp settled into something different after that evening, a quiet but unmistakable shift in how people spoke to Xiao Ying, no longer around her but to her, no longer weighing her worth in ledger terms but in the plain currency of gratitude. Whitfield kept his distance entirely, having lost both his purchase and, it seemed, some portion of his standing among men who now told the story of the silk with open admiration. Kwok began introducing her to new arrivals as the camp's healer rather than its cook, a title nobody had assigned her but that stuck regardless. Calder found her that night by the fire, later than usual, and said little beyond asking how the wounded were healing, though he stayed longer than the question required, and left only when the fire had burned down to coals. Xiao Ying, watching him go, understood that something had been settled between them in that tent full of wounded men that no torn contract could fully explain, and that whatever came next would have to be built the slow way, the way her mother had once told her the strongest stitches always were, one careful pass at a time, rather than all at once. The tunnel work resumed within the week, though under a method considerably closer to what Calder had argued for from the start. Smaller charges spaced more carefully through the fractured granite, a slower pace that the Eastern Office grudgingly accepted once Pruitt's revised report made clear whose judgment had actually been vindicated by the accident. The wounded men healed steadily under Xiao Ying's continued care, the herbal poultices supplemented now by a fresh supply of proper bandages Calder had specifically requested on the first wagon able to climb the cleared pass. Camp life settled into something gentler than Xiao Ying had known since arriving, evenings at the fire longer and easier, Tam's English lessons traded now for her lessons in return, full sentences instead of the careful 3 she'd practiced on the ship. Calder began walking her back from the mess tent most nights, a habit that started as simple courtesy and became, without either of them naming it, something closer to routine. 2 people who had already survived the hardest test of what they meant to each other, and were now, cautiously, learning the easier parts. He told her the rest of his sister's story on one of those walks, the parts he hadn't offered that gray dawn in the mess tent, how he'd left a comfortable position surveying for a coastal railroad specifically to work the harder, more dangerous mountain lines afterward, telling himself it was ambition when it had really been something closer to penance, a belief that hard, useful work in dangerous places might eventually balance some scale he couldn't otherwise settle. Xiaoying listened without offering easy comfort, understanding better than most what it meant to carry a debt no ledger could actually record. She told him in turn about her grandmother's teaching, about a lineage of women who read wounds and understood herbs, about how her mother had wept packing the satchel because a healer's daughter marrying into a laborer's contract meant burying that whole inheritance in a foreign kitchen instead of passing it forward. Calder said quietly that the inheritance hadn't been buried at all, that 8 men in that camp were walking around with their lives intact because of exactly the training her mother had feared would go to waste, and Xiaoying found she had no argument prepared against a comfort that plain and that true. He asked her properly on an evening in early spring, the first the pass had opened enough for wildflowers to push up through the last patches of snow along the grade, and he did it without ceremony, the way he did most things, simply stopping on the path back from the mess tent and saying that he'd like to marry her, not as a contract transferred from a dead man's paperwork, but as something chosen plainly, by both of them, if she wanted it too. Xiaoying stood quiet a moment, thinking of the ship, of the careful 3 sentences she'd practiced at the rail, of a paymaster's ledger that had once reduced her entire worth to a debt owed by a man she'd never met. She told him, in English that needed no careful counting anymore, that she had crossed an ocean once already for a marriage she hadn't chosen, and that she intended, this time, to choose it herself, out loud, in front of anyone who cared to hear. Calder, granite quiet as ever, allowed himself something close to a full smile, and said that camp gossip traveled fast enough that everyone would hear regardless, whether she announced it or not. Word of the engagement moved through camp exactly as fast as Calder had predicted, and within days, women from the camp's small circle of railroad wives had arrived at Xiaoying's tent with bolts of calico and a length of blue silk Calder had traded 2 months' wages to secure from a merchant's wagon that had finally made it up the cleared pass. Kwok produced, from some hidden corner of the kitchen stores, a spool of red thread he'd apparently been saving since the camp's founding for exactly this kind of occasion. Xiaoying found herself, for the first time since Guangzhou, sitting with a needle in hand, not out of necessity, but out of something closer to joy, stitching a new gown from fabric chosen this time by her own preference, rather than her mother's hope for a stranger's approval. The wedding trunk, emptied entirely during that long night at the tunnel mouth, began slowly filling again, not with a dead man's dowry, but with a life she had built herself, one careful stitch at a time, in a camp that had once weighed her worth in ledger columns, and now measured it in something considerably harder to write down. By the week of the wedding, the camp had transformed the preparation into something like a shared project. Drillers who'd once grumbled about Calder's favoritism now competing to build the finest arch of pine boughs for the ceremony. Tam appointing himself official messenger for a dozen small errands nobody had actually assigned him. Whitfield, conspicuously absent but no longer missed by anyone. Xiaoying finished the last seam on her new gown the night before, blue silk trimmed in the red thread Kwok had guarded so carefully, and laid it inside the trunk beside her mother's empty satchel, which she had decided, after much thought, to keep exactly as it was, empty, a record of what it had given, rather than a wound to be hidden. Calder came by that evening only briefly, as tradition apparently still demanded even at the edge of the Sierra wilderness, and said only that he'd see her tomorrow, that the whole camp would see her tomorrow, and that for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, he was looking forward to something without bracing himself first for what it might cost. The wedding took place on a morning bright enough that the granite walls of the pass seemed almost gold in the early light, snow retreating fast now up toward the peaks and leaving the grade lined with the same wildflowers that had pushed through weeks earlier. Xiaoying, dressed in the blue silk she'd stitched herself, jade comb from her mother fixed in her hair alongside a spray of mountain lupin Tam had gathered before dawn, and walked out from her tent to find nearly the entire camp assembled along the path. Drillers and cooks and even a few of the company clerks who'd once discussed her price in front of her, without a thought for whether she understood. Kwok walked beside her part way, since her own family remained an ocean away, and told her, in the dialect of home, that her mother would have been proud not of the silk she'd once carried, but of exactly how she had chosen to spend it, on strangers, who became something closer to family than the contract had ever promised her. The ceremony itself borrowed from both their worlds, a camp minister reciting vows Calder had insisted on writing partly himself, plain and unornamented the way he said everything true, and Kwok following with a shorter blessing in Cantonese that half the camp couldn't understand, and every one of them listened to anyway with genuine attention. Calder, when it came his turn to speak, said simply that he had learned more about worth from watching this woman tear apart everything she owned to save strangers than he had learned in a lifetime of company ledgers and company men deciding who counted and who didn't, and that he intended to spend the rest of his life making sure nobody in his camp ever again mistook a person for cargo. Shuoying answered in English steady and unhurried, the same language she'd once practiced in 3 careful sentences at a ship's rail, and said that she had crossed an ocean once for a marriage built entirely on paper, and was glad, now, to build this one on something considerably more solid than any contract a broker could write. The camp celebrated late into the evening with a feast Kwok had been quietly planning for weeks, tables of food from both traditions set side by side without much distinction anyone seemed to notice or mind, and word arrived partway through the festivities that the tunnel crew, working the last stubborn stretch of granite that same week, had finally broken through to open air on the mountain's far side, completing a passage that had taken the camp the better part of a hard winter and cost more than anyone wanted to remember. Calder received the news with quiet satisfaction rather than celebration, the way he received most things, and told Shoying later, away from the noise of the fire, that finishing the tunnel felt considerably less significant to him that day than finishing the walk he'd started toward her months earlier. From a stranger's careful 3 sentences to a wife standing beside him in silk she'd chosen and stitched herself. She said that a mountain and a marriage weren't so different in the end, both requiring patience, both demanding you trust the people working beside you, both worth the difficulty once you'd broken through to the other side. Long after the fire had burned down and the camp had finally quieted for the night, Shoying opened the wedding trunk one last time before sleep, not to take anything from it but simply to look. Her mother's satchel lay empty in one corner, kept deliberately rather than discarded, a record of exactly what it had given and to whom. Beside it lay the blue silk she'd stitched with her own hands, folded now the way she chose to fold it rather than the way tradition demanded. And beneath that, wrapped carefully, the first of what would become a small but growing collection of herbs and remedies she'd begun gathering again, now that spring had opened the mountain paths. The beginning of a healer's practice the whole camp had already started calling hers by name rather than by function. Calder found her there, sitting beside the open trunk in the lamplight, and asked what she was thinking. She told him she was thinking that a dowry was supposed to prepare a woman for a life already decided by other people, and that hers, torn apart and rebuilt on a mountainside neither of them had chosen but both of them had come to belong to, had ended up preparing her for a life she'd actually built herself, silk and stitches and all, exactly the way she wanted it.